ragazzi a scuola la chiamano coronavirus.
Ma io non sono un virus.
Avete capito che non siamo un virus?
Non sono un virus.
Non sono un virus.
Non sono un virus.
Non sono un virus.
This is how it started. And this is how it continued.
Dopo la chiusura della Lombardia, in 48 ore, decine di migliaia di persone fuggono in massa dal nord verso il sud.
Avete fatto stare in quarantena? No. Che prescrizioni vi hanno dato?
In quello stesso giorno, da Napoli, parte una durissima protesta nelle carceri.
I detenuti si stanno ribellando perché vogliono fare una morte, cazzo! Indulto! Perché devono morire come topi, tutti infettati! Fuori!
Dalle proteste sono stati interessati circa 4.000 detenuti. Una rabbia individuale che non esplodeva nelle carceri italiane da 40 anni. Rivolte attraverso l'uso di una violenza contro gli altri, ma anche contro se stessi, ha prodotto ben 13 morti.
Durante la sommossa, dal carcere di Foggia, riusciranno ad evadere 72 detenuti.
Tutti levati, tutti fuori! Hanno sfasciato tutto!
La situazione non è stata bellissima, soprattutto per i colleghi. È stato appunto questo tantam, questo passaparola, probabilmente perché i detenuti avevano dei mezzi di comunicazione. Hanno messo a ferro a fuoco 27 istituti, cioè non sono pochi.
La distanza sociale di 1 metro che si richiede all'esterno dentro è impossibile.
È per questo che sto per firmare un provvedimento che possiamo sintetizzare con l'espressione "io resto a casa". Non ci sarà più una zona rossa, non ci sarà più la zona 1 e la zona 2 della penisola. Ci sarà l'Italia, un'Italia zona protetta.
Andiamo sul Green Pass, che credo sia anche un incentivo a vaccinarsi e anche per i giovani italiani. Le leggo soltanto 2 righe. Vacciniamo e mettiamo in sicurezza chi ha dai 60 anni in su, soprattutto se vuole commentarli, visto che arrivano non da un privato cittadino con tentazione Novax, ma da uno dei leader che sostiene la sua maggioranza. Grazie.
Sì, 2 cose. L'appello a non vaccinarsi è un appello a morire, sostanzialmente. Non ti vaccini, ti ammali, muori. Oppure fai morire. Non ti vaccini, ti ammali, contagi, lui, lei muore. Questo è.
We now know that most of it was a combination of stupidity, pre-existent shortages, and incompetence mixed with lust for power and, yes, some nefarious influence mainly by the Chinese Communist Party. Exactly which proportions of each remains to be determined, and it's a topic that warrants very serious discussion, especially after the report published last month by Madrid-based civil rights group Safeguard Defenders, which shows Italy to be the home of at least 11 so-called unofficial Chinese police stations. To make things worse, these police stations have been around for 7 years already, and some of them have the official approval to patrol the streets of Italian cities, allegedly to assist Chinese tourists. Italy's first unofficial Chinese police station was set up as a pilot in Milan by Wenzhou Public Security Agency in May 2016, when the so-called Tourist Assisting Squad made its debut in Italy. Wenzhou went on to set up premises in Prato, which hosts the largest Chinese community in Italy. In 2018, shortly after the police patrol deal was reinforced, Xinjiang Public Security also set up a pilot office in Milan. As late as September 2022, the government, at the time led by Brussels' darling Mario Draghi, said these police stations were of, quote, no particular concern, unquote. The new government of Giorgia Meloni promised to take the Chinese problem more seriously. We'll see how that goes. It's too early to tell anyway. But until all of that is clarified, 2 things are clear. 1. The existence of these CCP offices had a strong influence on local authorities when the Wuhan flu panic first installed in Italy. And two, the reaction by Italy to the COVID-19 situation laid out the template for the rest of the West. Or, in other words, sanitary fascism came into our civilization through Italy. So much so that months into the so-called pandemic, news organizations from the US or France were using Italian footage to make their panic card propaganda. So, four of us, in a decision made more or less in the spur of the moment, descended upon Rome almost 3 years after this madness to see what are the lasting impacts. And what started as a quick trip for a little bit of fun became a very serious trip, at least for me. So, welcome to Rome. Let's explore.
Prossima fermata, Basilica San Paolo, treno che Requia. Next stop, Basilica San Paolo, train to Requia.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So, around the middle of December, a friend of the sofa from Italy was displaying too much blackpilling in public, insisting that Italy is the worst place to live in terms of socialism, authoritarianism, foreign totalitarian infiltration, and general populational brainwashing. To be fair, it's quite hard to disagree given the ostensive Russophilia and Sinophilia of the overwhelming majority of the Italian political class, the upside-down political system that effectively renders the country's constitution as no more than a software's terms of service which can be altered on a whim without much democratic input, or perhaps most importantly, the degree to which the plebs cooperated with the pandemic program, one in Europe exceeded only by the Germans. But while we expect that from the Germans, surely such compliance from a Latin people is quite a surprise. The stereotype that Latin peoples are rowdier exists for a reason, and the pandemic confirmed it. Violent protests were the norm in France and Spain, outright emigration occurred in Portugal, in Brazil the president opposed the program, and the rest of Latin America was shook by continuous massive protests throughout 2020 and 2021, regardless of what the regime believed about it. In Romania, the parliament got stormed just for the rumor that something like what Italy have been doing might be implemented. But not in Italy. Here, protests were mostly calm and rare. With the exception of early 2020, when a few people in Rome had the correct instinct and, as you can see in the video, pushed back physically against the sanitary fascism that was in the making. They were quickly pushed back by the overwhelming compliant majority which, unlike other places, genuinely believed the entire madness was necessary and a good thing. And that's after 2 months of propaganda of the kind I showed in the first seconds of this video. You see, before going full universal house arrest, the Italian government was very concerned with the people identifying the Wuhan flu as being, well, from Wuhan. And that was in the context in which hundreds of thousands of people from Wuhan live in Italy. The new Chinese year was around the corner and, perhaps most importantly, the country had just signed up to the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. Most of the people had no qualms in moving from believing that you should hug a Chinese to show your lack of bigotry or fear of the Wuhan flu to y'all stay in house arrest indefinitely because of the Wuhan flu. All within a span of 5 or 6 weeks, and they believed it with the same zeal. The adjective Orwellian comes to mind, as cliché as that may sound. So on this background, the pandemic insanity settled into Italy, and from there it spread to the rest of the West, much faster, with higher virulence, and with far worse consequences than the spread of the Wuhan flu itself.
Come stai a scrivere stronzate?
No, come scrivere stronzate?
Le stronzate che dici, le pubblichi sul tuo giornale. Adesso mi rispondi tu.
Certo.
2 anni di stronzate che scrivi. Guardami negli occhi, guardami negli occhi, guardami negli occhi, guardami negli occhi.
Ma terrorista di cosa?
Giornalista, terrorista!
Terrorista di cosa?
Stai lontano,
Tua figlia sotto la doccia, te ce la porti ancora?
Non ho capito, mia figlia è sotto la doccia?
Sì, che te via il cazzo.
Non mi toccare!
Lei è solo...
My previous visit to Rome had been exactly 4 years ago, in January 2019, on my way to and from Zimbabwe. And when I heard from other similarly well-traveled men that some global cities are effectively lifeless now after years of sanitary fascism, I leapt at the opportunity to check it out. And what best global city to check the hypothesis if not Rome? Though, to be fair, Milan would have been even better, since the pandemic madness did start in Milan, and from there it spread southwards to Rome, and from there everywhere else. But the black-pilled friend of the sofa mentioned at the beginning was closer to Rome than to Milan, so that's what we did. 3 Romanians and a Danish guy descended upon Rome to white-pill the depressed Italian, only I had another agenda: to look closely on details to see how much Rome had changed, and to see whether the others had a point about life having been sucked out of the cities. Well, the good news is that at least to Rome, this doesn't seem to be true, at least at a first glance. Somehow the city roared back to life for the most part. The nightclubs were full, tourists were around in reasonable numbers, at least by January standards, yet the aspect matters since more than half of the economy of Rome is tourism, and Termini, which is the main travel hub in the city, was in fact more crowded today than it was in January 2019. So on the macro level, bird's eye view, life is back into the city. But then it's the details that shock. The number of rough sleepers is higher, one gets harassed by people high on God knows what, and then there's the mess. The city is dirtier than 4 years ago. Now, make no mistake, Rome has a long history of being dirtier than the European median, but still, Rome today is dirty even by Rome standards. And it's not dirty in some corners, let's say where partygoers flock, or next to stadiums, or in touristy areas, or other specific areas where some level of littering is to be expected. No. Rome is equally dirty in all areas except the places full of tourists where it's kept squeaky clean so it can attract more tourists. This, for instance, is in the east. This is in the far east. This is in the south. This is in the southeast. You get the point. It's a different kind of dirty than what you'd find in most cities of Europe. In most cities of Europe, you have a few problematic areas that tend to be dirty, and those are usually around stadiums, nightclub areas, or areas where low-level street crime is high. In Rome, there's a little bit of littering everywhere, and little by little, it forms a carpet of littering. Again, everywhere. Except these nice, polished historical areas which seem to have less of it, either because tourists don't spend enough time to get accustomed with the local habits, or because they're cleaned much more often. Experience suggests it's a combination of the two. But okay, littering is, after all, not that spectacular. Except in Rome, this has led to the emergence of wild boars into the city. And not just into the periphery, sometimes around the Vatican too. Now, I didn't catch any of those on camera because during winter they venture less often into the city and stay a bit more on the outskirts in the wider Lazio region. Nevertheless, wild boars. And then there are the even smaller things that are really weird if one doesn't know the context, such as the fact that we couldn't visit the Colosseum like normal people. You see, I've been in over 100 countries to, I think, over 15,000 tourist attractions, large and small, known and less known, and in both highly techno-optimistic places like Singapore, United Arab Emirates, China, or Kazakhstan, and less techno-optimistic places like Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Mexico, or Albania. Every single time the admission fee was payable in cash. Well, I hadn't tried the Colosseum so far, clearly. Although I've been to Rome multiple times, I was always busy and in town with some tasks and never really had the time to enjoy the city. So this quick trip was, at least in part, a way to finally get some fun for me personally out of Rome, a city that I still enjoy with all of its flaws. But no luck. In order to visit the Colosseum, you have to sign up on a website that looks like the internet of the 1990s, pay only through that website, and then print out the receipt yourself and show up with it at the gate. There is no other way, which in practicality meant 80% of the visitors were Chinese because statistically, Chinese citizens are the least likely to be bothered by this pretentious nonsense. So I walked around the Colosseum and that was it. According to the locals, the exclusively online version was introduced with the so-called pandemic, and it stayed that way. And it's not like they saved up on employees or anything. The employees who would take cash now wander around trying to read bad print or scan dirty screens. And overall, it's more expensive because the administration has to pay for the upkeep of the software, in addition to the employees and the bank fees. So, great progress, comrades. Now, I said that I walked around the Colosseum. Well, walking on the streets of Rome is an adventure in itself. 2 years ago, I made a video complaining about not being able to walk around my neighborhood because there's too many goddamn cars parked everywhere. Well, Rome is the same, only worse. It's not many places where cars park in the middle of the roundabout.
No. Hai să lăsăm autobuzul să treacă. Hai, boss. Nu-mi capete. Bro. Dai de pe supapu. Bienvenido alla Italia. Italia, mamma mia.
Shit like this is one of the many reasons, besides corruption and terrible management, why you don't wait for a bus in Rome, because it either arrives late or may never come. While I've been to cities far more difficult to navigate, such as Tashkent, where crossing a big boulevard is an adventure in and of itself, or Washington, D.C., where sidewalks are non-existent in large parts of the city, Rome is still way up there in physical difficulty to navigate. The redeeming part is that nobody is angry, and since everyone, pedestrians and drivers, is aware that all rules are optional, everyone goes slowly and avoids sudden moves. It's pretty anarchic, really. But not anarchic like in Istanbul or Addis Ababa, where a different order emerges out of the chaos. In Rome, there is no order. You just walk or drive and try your best not to bump into someone. Public transport, with the exception of the subway, is a source of clown world stuff in and of itself. The buses are one thing, but then there's the trams. So I saw on a physical map, because that's how I navigate everywhere, that there is a tram that connects the Vatican to the rest of the tram network. Now, the tram network in Rome is not exactly a network, but rather a fragmented mishmash of what is left of what used to be one of the largest tram networks in Europe. I had read prior to the visit that the network is mostly new nowadays, with some of the oldest segments going back only to 1983. So at least in theory, the tram experience should be at its worst like in Eastern Europe and better in the rest of the time. Little did I know that the exact opposite was the case. So I took tram 19, the most important line in the city, because it connects with all the other segments with the terminus at the Vatican. This is how it sounded. Sweet Mother of Jesus, this makes the trams in Dnipropetrovsk look like a beacon of comfort, futuristic civilization by comparison. I mean, at least the trams in the Ukrainian city do run on time and at reasonable speeds, and aren't that old. The fact that Rome uses some really old, run-down trams wouldn't be a big deal if the network had been old, like it is the case in some cities of Germany or most of Eastern Europe. But the network is really young. It has a long history, but by the 1960s it had been destroyed, torn apart, or abandoned. It was slowly revived starting in 1983, but only became somewhat functional in 1998, and most of the current network is less than 20 years old. So from that perspective, and given just how heavily Rome taxes both its residents and its tourists, this was shocking to see. And then there are the architects who keep on having new ideas. On one hand, it's the Eur neighborhood, where one can admire raw fascist architecture combined with so-called modern architecture. They're both ugly and soulless, but don't tell that to the hipsters flocking to these areas. They'll take you for a backwards rube. Well, to be fair, we were backwards rubes since we refused to get QR coded for a coffee and failed to take selfies with the palace of the labor civilization. This is the best frame I have with it because I found nothing beautiful about it and needed a coffee. Now, this is one of the things that I love about Italy. There's always good coffee available within walking distance no matter where you are. The downside is that their good coffee comes in small doses, so I always have to ask for 3 or 4. Not having taken the COVID shot means I can still take 4 ristrettos even as I age, so there's that. And since we're at architects having new ideas, it is perhaps right to also show you these things. On our way to Piazza di Spagna, we stumbled upon these things. The metro exit that goes straight on top of these Spanish steps was closed or under renovation. While the metro itself still functions really well, getting in and out of it is now very confusing due to most stations having portions that are perpetually under renovation. Anyway, so while heading towards one of the most touristy areas of Rome via a less mainstream route, we stumbled upon these things. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what the hell this is, I just know that it's ugly. Europe is known for its architectural conservatism, but that's mostly PR. In reality, it's a lot more like this. While some blends between the old and the new can be quite nice, most are simply not. So, there's that. And while we're at architecture, let me note something else. In every video about Rome, most of the footage shown to you is from places like these, or like these. And it's true, Rome has a lot of walkable neighborhoods in its vast city center that do look great for both vlogging purposes and as a moment to take a walk for the uplifting of one's spirit. But most of Rome just isn't like that. A lot of Rome is more like this. To be fair, if I show just this frame and won't say it's from Rome, one would be forgiven for thinking it comes from some godforsaken ex-Soviet town. And this is one of the reasons I'm so utterly shocked at just how easily, pardon my French, urban Italians have taken it up their asses with the universal house arrest of the so-called pandemic. The living quarters in most of Rome, and other cities are not much different in Italy, are good enough for a mobile people who always move around for both work and fun. But as a place to spend one's whole day, and especially 2 or 3 months in a row, that's a recipe for disaster, especially in the mental health department. The ghouls and the CCP shills that promoted the pandemic program here and later on in the rest of the West tried hard to paint this as something not just honorable, but with a sort of mystique attached to it through propaganda videos like these. And it worked, because most people watching them had no idea just how tight the living quarters routinely are in Italian cities. And far from being glamorous, so many of these neighborhoods are supremely depressing, architecture-wise. North American intellectuals like to point out the evils of brutalist neighborhoods in Eastern Europe, and for the most part, they're right about it. But what too many intellectuals, especially but not exclusively North American, don't say is that plenty of places in Western Europe are full of this as well. From Sweden's miljonprogrammet to these places in Rome, not to mention most cities in Germany or the social housing in Paris, they're really everywhere. In the past, these kinds of buildings were like the projects in the United States, but slowly, in more and more places in West Europe, they're becoming just regular housing, and at steep prices too, just like they've always been in Eastern Europe. I mean, we did tell you on the sofa that you're all living in Eastern Europe now. And in the case of Italy, at least sometimes, it kinda does apply. The problem is that it's not 2023 Eastern Europe, but more like 1993 Eastern Europe. Again, I've been to Italy multiple times, and unless I kick the bucket soon, I expect to visit Italy multiple times in the future as well. It's a place I like visiting. The people are warm, the climate is quite tolerable most of the time, and there's always some cute place that you've missed the last time. After all, Italy itself is a gigantic open-air museum. But to the point of 1993 Eastern Europe, well, let's just say that up until 2015 or so, I would perceive Italy as being moderately expensive. Cheaper than most of the rest of West Europe, but still expensive. Certainly more expensive than my backyard and requiring some moderately careful budgeting before hopping on the plane. After 2015, Italy became more and more like Romania, but not just because the purchase power parity of a Romanian income had increased, but also because the purchasing power of Italians kept on dropping. And now, in post-pandemic, all four of us kinda agreed that the place was much cheaper than expected. Now, that in itself is great news for us as visitors, but terrifying news for the locals. You see, when more than half of the economy of the capital city is tourism, and even with cheaper prices your business still kinda struggles, that doesn't bode well for the near future. To give you an idea, eating out in a tourist trap just in front of the Pantheon was cheaper than a similar meal in my hometown of Cluj-Napoca. Now, sure, on one hand, this also says something about how ludicrously expensive my hometown has become, but even in absolute terms, it was a bit over 100 euros at a table of 5, and we were starving as we had walked for miles and miles on end around the city. And the Pantheon is in the middle of the historical center, so you can't get more tourist trap than this area. For comparison, in my last day, I was killing time in the outskirts trying to catch footage like this. I hit a very working-class Romanian restaurant at the end of the day. I had caught some cough and really needed a soup. For less than 15 euros, I had enough food that I had difficulties moving afterwards. Again, all of this is great news for travelers like me, but for the locals, they're already feeling the start of a very long recession. Most of the locals are poorer today than they were in 2019 and expect to get even poorer. One can also see this in the migration patterns too. Most of the working class folk from Eastern Europe that found good opportunities here 20 years ago are now leaving. And while 20 years ago young folks from Eastern Europe would move here for work, now young folks from Eastern Europe come here for a quick visit or to buy some real estate. That speaks to the economic growth and increase of opportunities in Eastern Europe, but also speaks to the decline of attractiveness of Italy. Nowadays, instead of Eastern Europeans willing to work, legally or not, Italy gets very fit, fighting-age men from Africa who, statistically speaking, have very little desire to work. Ultimately, I've only walked around for a few days in the capital, so I can't and I won't claim to have made a thorough research. More like an incursion, though in a place with which I'm very familiar. And from that position, I will say that the trajectory doesn't look good at all. Italy is one of Europe's countries whose population is in fact decreasing, and has been for 4 years now. The country's median age is almost 47, which makes it as the third oldest country in the world, just behind Japan and Germany. But unlike Japan and Germany, Italy is getting into this territory much less prepared. Generational wealth has been encroached upon tremendously by the successive socialist governments in ways that would get a politician impaled in Eastern Europe. And in a country where working the farm of your family is very common, the government made it illegal for children to work with and for their parents if it is for profit. That's shocking for someone like me, also from a country with a strong rural tradition where not even the communists dare to do such thing. And all of this is on top of the messed up geopolitics of the country, the brainwashed urban populace, and the straitjacket of the euro currency. So many are putting their hopes in Giorgia Meloni, but people forget that on average a cabinet stays around for 13 months in Italy. And Meloni-chan is not some supernatural force. Yes, she can change some of the messed up geopolitics, and to her credit, she did take a few steps in the correct direction by opening up a strategic partnership with Japan, letting the Belt and Road Initiative lapse in line with her campaign promise to take at least a Sino-skeptical stance, and so on. She can do that, but she can't and won't, not anytime soon, fix the social and especially the structural economic damage done by decades of socialism. Even if one would assume that Fratelli d'Italia, which is Meloni's party, is full of pure, kind-hearted angels, most of what needs to be done cannot be done in the current circumstances when most of the local and regional structures are firmly in the hands of the Democratic Party's mafia. Oh yeah, speaking of which, the mafia is real. It's just that there isn't one mafia. Pop culture and NPC media have told you about the Sicilian crime syndicate, the 'Ndrangheta, the Camorra, and the Apulian syndicate. Now, those are real, but they're not the only players in town, and in some aspects they're not even the most relevant ones. In fact, if you want to see the real-life incarnation of this famous cartoon, visit Italy and get acquainted to how this country works. Sure, there are worse places out there in terms of corruption, but in Europe, nobody has such a working balance between the government mafia and the private sector mafia. It's either a dominance by the private sector mafia, like Albania for instance, or a dominance by public sector mafia, like Denmark, and a lot of in between. But Italy has an almost perfect balance, which can sometimes be advantageous, but not when trying to undo decades of compounded, terrible decision-making. Just as I was riding the metro in Rome, news broke out that the authorities arrested Matteo Messina Denaro, a crime boss who has been wanted for 30 years on multiple high-profile homicides, including killings of prosecutors and public bombings, which today would be called terrorism. Italians were glued to the screens on the footage related to his arrest, and the news was broadcasted everywhere. So much so that even techno-conservatives like me, without a smartphone and a mobile internet connection, and also without a TV set in my hotel room, still learned about it and saw the newsreel. Great PR for the new government, I guess, but also a testament of the level of corruption. You can't tell me this guy has been living in Sicily for so long, in fact was also following medical treatment, yet somehow nobody saw him even though his mugshot was in every police station in the nation. And there's freaking police everywhere. This is what Meloni-chan has to face, which is precisely why I will be surprised if she'll still be Prime Minister by January 2024. So yeah, all in all, business as usual in Italy. The pandemic madness accelerated some pre-existing trends, sure, made the life of small business owners even worse, and made the mental health of the nation far worse. Effectively, Italy is the extreme version of the evil perpetrated by most of the West, plus Russia and China, make everything far worse for the young, just so 81-year-olds can live a little longer. Part of it was Chinese disinformation, yes. Part of it was stupidity and lust for power in various bureaucrats, from Prime Minister Conte down to the pettiest mayor. But a lot of this madness was possible in Italy also because of their unholy level of reverence for their elderly, way past the limits of common sense. It was indeed quite funny to watch the conversations between the Danish chap and the Italian friend of the sofa. Denmark is on the other end of the spectrum, where the regime softly encourages the elderly to consider assisted suicide. Both extremes are toxic. And the obsession of Italians to keep their elderly alive for as long as possible has thus been successfully used against the nation. No wonder the youth is pretty hopeless now. Why wouldn't they be? Their state effectively crapped on their mental and financial health just so Genitore Primo can live up to 89 years old and 2 months instead of only 88 years old and 11 months. Nobody can predict what the long-term consequences will be, but one thing is certain. For most of the part, it ain't pretty.
Terrible position of the right on families.
So there you go, Circo Massimo, and it's straight into the corner of the UN.
Circo Massimo, okay, where do we... Oh, it's the UN, yeah, that makes too much sense.
I wasn't joking when I told you that it is that honk.
Yeah, you have now arrived at the maximal circus, and it's like, oh, the UN? Yep. Yeah, and then you look around and it's like, oh, there's this thing over here that's the maximal search.
Yep, it goes straight into the HQ.
So yeah, that's really all I had to say. All in all, I still had fun in Rome, and I'm looking forward to paying another visit to Italy when the next occasion shall arise. The best one can do at this point is to visit the place to at least preserve the memory. Regardless of the machinations of politics and government, fundamental changes will come to Italy, one way or the other. Dictated by demographics if they can't be dictated by ideas. But more on that some other time. Maybe at my next visit. Someone did suggest that I do an anthropological type of visit, preferably to Milan-Bergamo area. It's not a bad idea, and, shekels willing, I might actually do it. Surely that would produce a slightly more serious video than this one. So, with all of that said, thank you all for watching. Many thanks to those who support our work. Visit our website, don't forget to subscribe, and yeah, I will see you all soon on The Freedom Alternative.